Part 2. Rude Awakening. 17. My eyes snapped open. I stared up at the moonlit shadows on the ceiling, wondering if the loud bang had been from a dream I couldn't remember. That was a gunshot. Indigo's soft voice beside me dispelled any doubt that I had dreamed it. I quickly got out of bed and began pulling on my jeans as a burst of automatic gunfire, followed by a distant scream, sent a jolt of electricity through me. We're under attack. I half fell, sat on the bed, and began to pull on my boots, my fingers suddenly clumsy with alarm. Indigo was already out of bed and carefully bundling up the still sleeping Max. Bang, bang, bang. Quick, you better get him down to the basement. We should get all the girls down there. Yep, Indigo said. All business now. I went to the closet and pulled my pistol and a rifle out and ran to the door. Indigo waited for me there, and we kissed as Ben and Luke ran down the hallway past us. Come on, lovebird, said Luke, his voice sounding excited and not at all scared. Those shots came from the gate. Be careful, said Indigo. I will. Make sure you take some guns down to the basement, and don't come out until you hear one of us give the all clear. I kissed Max on the top of the head, and Brooke arrived carrying a pistol, just as I turned to run after my two friends. Make sure Luke doesn't do anything crazy, she called after me. We flew down the stairs 2 at a time and ran through the living room, bursting out of the blue door onto the veranda. It was a dark night, and my eyes took a few seconds to adjust as we sped up the hill towards the screaming, shouting, and shooting. More of our people were running from the direction of the barn and the living quarters around it. Some were whooping with excitement, others wide-eyed with fear. It was hard not to get caught up in the excitement, our fear of the unknown balanced by the feeling of camaraderie and safety in numbers. Luke was a lanky shadow loping ahead of us, and he slowed as we approached Boot Hill, a large mound the drive curled around before it straightened and went on to the gates. He turned and motioned all of us to slow and made a chopping motion against his throat with his hook. The whooping of the others slowly subsided as we caught up to him. The crack of gunfire continued behind the small hill. Luke did a quick head count as we gathered round. You 8, he pointed. Continue along the driveway, single file, and stick as close to the hill as you can. Isaac, Ben, and I will go around. He was interrupted by an almighty crash from the direction of the gate, followed by the shriek of metal on metal and roar of an engine. Come on, they're through, yelled Luke. We ran after him. I can't speak for anyone else, but I felt a righteous anger that someone had dared break through our gate and come at my people. We rounded the hill and began towards the gate. I could make out about 12 shapes on foot, climbing over the debris of the gate and the part of the wall that had caved in with it. In front of them, speeding towards us, was the vehicle which had broken through our defenses. It was an olive green truck with a heavy metal grate fastened to its front end and steel plates over its windshield. There were 2 narrow horizontal slits for the driver to see through, and the plating was clearly not part of the original design. I could see shapes scattered around the wreckage of the gate. Bodies. The bodies of our people. A snarl escaped my lips as I began to shoot at the interlopers. Most of the others with us were not armed with guns, but thankfully all of the attackers didn't appear to be armed either. Perhaps surprised by our numbers, the invaders began to slow and fall in behind the vehicle, which had now slowed to provide cover. I saw at least 2 invaders return my fire. One of our guys fell, winged, a quiet kid with blonde hair who had only arrived a year before. My next shot found its mark and the shooter fell, holding his belly. I saw Luke from the corner of my eye. He stopped, half-turned, and raised his small crossbow, bracing it on his hook. The remaining enemy gunmen saw Luke and took aim at him, even as he became a target himself. I began to bring my gun around too, when an enraged shriek to my right distracted me. A kid from our side was running at the gunman, a tomahawk raised above his head. The enemy didn't hesitate. He turned his automatic weapon on the kid and let off a burst of gunfire that ceased a split second later when the arrow from Luke's crossbow found him. Both the invader and the kid with the tomahawk crashed to the ground a few feet apart, the enemy clutching at the bolt in his chest, and the kid from our side silent and bloody. Luke threw his crossbow to the ground. It was only good for one shot because he was unable to reload quickly with his one hand. He pulled a pistol from his belt and began shooting at the slots in the truck's armored windshield. I fired off a shot too, then decided to concentrate on the fighters sheltering behind the vehicle. I managed to hit one just as the others from our side reached the now almost stationary vehicle, swarming around it and engaging the enemy in vicious close-quarters combat. From my position to the left of the vehicle, I got a good look at the driver, the glow of the dashboard just enough to display his features. It wasn't Ash. I had no doubt our attackers were from his gang of marauders, but the driver's eyes were dark, not the eerie light blue of their leader. The driver snarled as Luke's well-aimed bullets pinged around the slit and hit the gas, obviously deciding enough was enough. He aimed straight for Luke, just missing two more of our defenders as they dived out of the way. Luke waited until the last possible second, then dove out of the way of the 2 tons of metal death barreling at him. He wasn't quite quick enough. The edge of the heavy grate on the front of the truck smacked his ankle, sending him spinning into the dirt. The driver swung around and rushed back up the hill before pulling up sharply near the fighting, the truck's tires spitting dirt and gravel. "Grab one of them, Thompson," the driver yelled. I broke into a run. The one called Thompson jumped out and snatched one of our smaller boys. I recognized him as Benjamin, the kid originally from Joe and Brock's group. Thompson was bundling him into the passenger door by the time I got there. I couldn't shoot without the possibility of hitting Benjamin, so I ran at him, hoping to wrestle him away before he was taken. The driver grabbed Benjamin by the hair and floored the gas again, taking off even before his own guy could get back in safely. I dove, grabbing the one called Thompson's leg as he struggled to climb into the moving vehicle behind their captive. Thompson held on grimly and used his other leg to kick at me. I could hear Benjamin calling out for help, but it was no use. My grip began to slip, the buffeting of the dirt driveway on my legs and feet making it impossible to hold on. Finally, I fell away, rolling several times before coming to a halt. I held nothing for my efforts but a worn running shoe. I climbed to my feet, remarkably undamaged by my struggle and subsequent fall. I took aim and shot at the rear tires in one last effort to stop the speeding truck. I missed and watched helplessly as the truck careened back over the rubble of the gate and out onto the road. "Fuck!" I yelled in frustration before running back to the fighting. I got there as more of our people began arriving. Some of the invaders fled after the truck, obviously not liking the odds, but the rest continued to fight. I tried to aim at the invaders in the melee, but there was no way I could shoot the enemy without risking my own people. I took the option of firing a shot into the air. It had the desired effect. Everybody froze, and I pointed my gun at the face of one of them. It was a kid with a shaved head and freckled face. He immediately dropped his weapon, a short, blood-stained axe, and held up his hands. The other 3 looked like they were considering fighting on when Luke arrived, his gun and hook glinting in the moonlight. His appearance seemed to help them make the right decision, and they also dropped their weapons and put up their hands. "Get on the ground!" Luke screamed at them. They dropped, and Ben began to collect their weapons, an assortment of modified tools. Luke holstered his gun and picked up the axe the freckle-faced kid had dropped. There was crying and angry shouts from those arriving on the scene as they discovered the destruction of life and limb wrought upon our tight-knit community in those few minutes of mayhem. Now that the heat of the battle had begun to subside, I felt sick and noticed that my hands were shaking. Our one pickup truck arrived, driven by Jamal. He, Danny, Allie, and Bo jumped out and began to help Ben tend to the wounded. "Danny, Bo, can you make sure these prisoners are tied up and guarded? Luke and I need to inspect the damage," I said. We ran to the gate. There was no sign of the truck or of the enemy who had run away on foot. It was over as quickly as it had begun, only a trail of death and destruction to mark the enemy's passing. "They must have had another vehicle waiting," Luke said, standing at the broken gates and looking down the empty road. What are we going to do about Benjamin? I don't know. Of course, I wanted to go after them, to bring him back safely, but we couldn't do that right then. Maybe not at all. All 4 of our guards were down and, I feared, dead. They had fought valiantly. We found 3 dead attackers outside of the wall and another inside the perimeter. We checked our people one by one. 2 had been shot, and another, a girl I didn't recognize, had a large, slashing wound across her neck and down into her chest. The axe. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the starry sky as if amazed by what she saw there. I gently closed them and felt a cold rage begin to build in me. The last body was that of a young kid of about 14. He was lying broken and bleeding in tire tracks left by the truck. Luke stood back up and faced me, his mouth grim. We'll have to work through the night to get the gate back up. We might have to use one of the buses to block it until we can establish something more permanent. "18. We worked all through what was left of the night, and by dawn we had managed to repair the wall and bring one of the school buses up to use as a makeshift gate. We had worked with a sense of urgency because, at that point, none of us knew if or when the marauders would be back with a larger force. Morning finally dawned as we finished. Exhausted, I walked down to visit the injured. Jamal had set up some tents and was tending to the wounds of the injured with what passed as medical equipment in our world. At best, that consisted of splints, bandages, antiseptic, and painkillers. Down the hill, Ben and a few of the others were gathering and organizing the bodies of our dead. Besides the kidnapped boy, Benjamin, we had lost 4 people at the gate and another 2 when fighting off the invaders. The boy carrying the tomahawk was alive, but in a very bad way. The bullets had shattered the bones in his upper arm. Jamal shook his head when I looked at him. There were 3 more injured. 1 had a broken leg, and the other 2 had more superficial wounds from the fighting. They should all be okay if we can keep their wounds clean. All told, we had killed 5 of the enemy and had taken 4 prisoners. As I walked out of the tent, I heard a heart-wrenching wailing. I froze and looked towards the group gathered solemnly around our dead. A girl of about 8 was holding and hugging the girl who had been killed by the axe wielder, the blood of the dead girl marring the white sweater she was wearing. Jamal joined me. It's her sister. All of the fear, sadness, and anger of the last few hours hit me like a freight train, and I felt the embers of my cold anger flare into something much more powerful. There would be an accounting, and it would be now. I changed course and stalked towards the prisoners, pulling out my pistol as I went. Danny stood guard over them, a pistol in his hand. His uncertain look in my direction alerted them, and all 4 looked frightened as I approached. My fury was as obvious as if my hair had been on fire, and they recoiled when I reached them. I leaned over and grabbed the freckled axeman by the collar of his shirt and dragged him over to our dead, his feet kicking in the dust as he tried to escape. The little girl shrieked when she saw us approaching and fell over her sister as if to protect her. I didn't notice. I swung the killer around, bunching his collar in my hand, squeezing tight as I shook him, his face just inches from the pale face of his victim. You see what you've done, you fuck, you murdering fuck? I spat. I jammed my gun against his temple. What do you have to say? I'm sorry. Please don't kill me. Please. Too late for sorry, asshole. I forced the barrel harder against his temple and began to squeeze the trigger. Isaac! Indigo's voice cut through the fog of my rage like a laser through dark night. I froze and looked up. In her arms she held Max, my beautiful son. Tears filled my eyes. He has to die for what he did, I said simply. Not like this, Isaac. Not here. Not now. She nodded towards the grieving, frightened girl in front of us. It's not how we do things. No, I struggled to find the words to explain why it had to happen. She walked up to me and gently placed her hand over mine. Not like this. From the comfort of his mother's arms, my little boy looked up at me, his eyes deep pools of blue, and smiled a gummy smile. The fight went out of me. I let her pull my gun hand away from its intended target. I released the killer's collar, and he fell to his hands and knees, coughing and choking for air. Luke came over, his face unreadable, and helped the jittery killer back to his comrades. Come and rest, Indigo said, tugging gently at my gun hand. I nodded, tucked my gun into my jeans, and allowed her to lead me back to the house. 19. Indigo persuaded me to have a nap upon our return to the house. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but I eventually did and woke 2 hours later, fuzzy-headed and hungry. I had a late breakfast and called a council meeting to decide what we would do in light of the attack. Our first decision was quick and easy. Both Brock and Joe had a passion for motorcycles and had kept the 4 bikes we had obtained over the years well maintained. We sent a team of 3 on motorcycles, led by Joe, to monitor the road from Ashland. They were given enough supplies for 2 days. The bikes were our fastest and least obtrusive form of transport, and if the marauders did decide to return, I wanted plenty of warning. They were under strict orders not to engage the enemy and to return at speed if they spotted them heading our way. Next came the question of the 4 prisoners. It was decided unanimously the 4 would be tried for murder the following day. The only issue to debate was what punishment would be imposed when, if, we found them guilty. The worst crimes we'd had to deal with prior to the invasion had been stealing and assault. We hadn't been afraid to make hard decisions and had actually exiled several people from the valley. That particular punishment seemed to be enough of a deterrent to most of our citizens. We had only debated execution in what-if terms. As I expected, most of the girls were dead set against the idea, all except Brooke. We can't just banish them, argued Luke. What kind of punishment is that? They'll just go straight back to their people and try to kill more of us as soon as they get the chance. Luke's right. They've all got blood on their hands. Execution is the only thing that makes sense, said Paul. I don't have the answers, said Indigo. But how can you even think of doing that? Who is going to shoot them? Are you going to pull the trigger, Paul? Luke? Paul reddened. If I have to, yes, said Luke resolutely. Why are we having a trial at all? Asked Allie. It seems we've already decided they're guilty. But they are, said Danny. Isaac, what do you think? I looked around the room, my gaze falling on them one by one, until finally coming to rest on Indigo. We can't let them go, I said. And we can't lock them up. Executing them is the only way. I saw tears in Indigo's eyes. Brooke put her hand on hers, even though she was of the same opinion as me. I felt like the world's biggest bastard, but we had to do what was right by all of us. We know they're all guilty, but we'll have a trial anyway. Our people need to see that we're not just thoughtless killers. We have to talk about what they did, and then we have to sentence them to death. Not guns, though. I know another way. Quick and painless. "20. The next day dawned bright and sunny. Given what we had to do that day, I would have preferred an overcast, miserable morning. I wasn't in a great mood when I woke up. Indigo had been cool towards me when we had retired for the evening, but at least she hadn't rejected my kiss goodnight. Indigo was silent as we ate breakfast in our room. It was nothing fancy, just some bread and peanut butter we kept in the cupboard in case of hunger attacks. I don't think either of us felt like eating breakfast with the group. Certainly she didn't fight me when I suggested eating in our room. I was feeling lousy, like I had let her down, but I knew in my heart it was the right decision. I washed the last of my bread down with water. "Well, I better get dressed and go downstairs," I said, pushing my chair away and standing up. Indigo grabbed my hand and squeezed it. Her face was sad, but that simple gesture let me know everything was okay between us. That said, as I got dressed, I still felt there was a heavy black cloud hanging over me. Execution might be the right thing to do, the only thing, but being right didn't make it any easier. Luke and I had a brief discussion about how we would conduct the trial, and at 9 a.m. we went out onto the veranda. Luke was holding a bullhorn we had discovered in a school 2 years before. It made a horrible screeching sound when he first put it to his mouth, and those of us closest to him clapped our hands over our ears. No one giggled, though. I wasn't the only one feeling the gravity of the situation. "Attention, everybody. Please gather in the square. I repeat, gather in the square." Slowly but surely, our people emerged from their quarters, or left the jobs they had been doing, and began to congregate in front of the raised veranda. We had named that patch of ground the square, and it's where we held all of our community meetings and celebrations, including Thanksgiving and Christmas. We were silent as we waited for the stragglers to join us. Looking at the sea of upturned faces and listening to the excited buzz of conversation, I was struck by how big we'd grown. The talk died down as Luke stepped to the edge of the veranda again and held up the bullhorn. "People of the valley, we are gathered here to conduct a trial and pass judgment on the people who attacked our home and killed our people in the early hours of yesterday morning." "Shoot the fuckers!" someone called from the crowd, and it was followed by a chorus of approval and yes. "Quiet down, please," said Luke, holding his hook up like an unintentional threat. The crowd slowly fell into silence. This wasn't to be a trial that would have been familiar to anyone from the before days. There was no judge, no lawyers, no jury. Those of us in the Valley Council were essentially judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. Besides the triumvirate, Luke, Jamal, and myself, that year's council was made up of Paul, a boy named Robert who had arrived 2 years before, Allie, and Danny. The council was elected every year to govern the everyday running of the valley. The triumvirate had veto power over any matter, but ever since we'd formed the first council in our second year, we had never had to use it. It was a testament to our single-mindedness when it came to the good of the group. We were all seated on chairs on the veranda overlooking the crowd. Ben was to act as the court attendant. When Luke settled the crowd and had taken his seat, Ben stepped up and cupped his hands to his mouth. "Bring out the prisoners." The 4 prisoners were led out by 2 of our people, members of Luke's security team. The killers had been locked up in the compound, a small enclosure we had built near the trees at the rear of the property. They looked a little worse for the rough night's sleep they had endured. Their hands were tied in front of them, and I made a mental note to talk to Luke about teaching his men to tie them behind in the future. They were brought to a stop in front of the veranda and told to turn and face us. 3 of them had their heads bowed. Whether in contrition or in the hope we would take pity upon them, I'm not sure. The axe killer looked up at us with defiance. I nodded to Ben. "You 4 are charged with murder and injury of the innocent. How do you plead?" "Fuck off," spat the defiant one. I felt fury at his attitude and struggled to find something to say. Ben beat me to it. "I'll take that as a guilty plea," he said smoothly. "Thank you. What about you 3? The others were more circumspect. 2 of them pled guilty quietly. The third started to cry. "I didn't kill anyone," he blubbered. "Did you shoot anyone?" Ben asked, no sympathy coloring his voice. "Yes, but I only winged him. I hit his arm." "Right, so you tried to murder him, but your aim was shit." "Yeah, but I didn't. He's alive." Ben jumped down from the veranda and stalked up to the youth, leaning over him threateningly. The boy cringed from Ben's obvious anger. "He'll be dead by the morning," he said in a low, dangerous voice. The boy's face collapsed, and he began to sob. "I don't wanna die." "Shut the fuck up, Sing. Goddamn crybaby. They'll get what's coming when Ash comes back." Ben turned his attention to the freckle-faced axe killer. "You're a lot braver today than you were yesterday." "Whatever," the boy snarled. Ben turned on his heels and stepped back onto the veranda and faced them again. "You stand before our council," he said more formally. "They will decide your fate. How do you vote, council?" Luke was the first to stand. "Guilty." I stood. "Guilty." Indigo stood, and I held my breath as she paused, looking down at the 4. "Guilty," she said quietly and sat down. The rest of the council stood, one by one, and delivered the same verdict. "What is the punishment you've decided?" asked Ben, once we were all seated again. This time I stood. "The penalty is death." Still, the axe killer was defiant, his teeth bared in a silent growl. The others, even the crying one, took the pronouncement with an air of resignation. "Take them to the barn." The 2 guards moved to take the prisoners away, and I felt myself relax. I turned to Indigo and was about to comfort her when, to my right, Allie screamed. I looked her way reflexively before the sound of scuffling alerted me to the danger behind us. I quickly fell on Indigo, pushing her to the floor as the loud clap of a gunshot sent the crowd scattering. The shot shattered the window we had been standing in front of just a millisecond before, glass spraying over us as we fell to the floorboards. Later, I was told the axe killer had grabbed a pistol from one of the guards and had immediately aimed for me. Only Allie's scream and my quick reaction had saved us. Call it fate, or luck, or karma, or whatever the hell you want. But that morning, for the first time in 2 years, I had put my gun holster on. Luke was on his haunches beside me, cursing as he struggled to free his own gun with his good hand. There was another shot, and I saw the second guard go down as the killer, his arm around the first guard's neck, backed up, his gun waving this way and that as the crowd scattered behind him. I didn't hesitate. I got to my feet and aimed at his hateful face. He shot again, and I flinched. Thankfully, his arm was less sure this time, and I heard a groan behind me. I couldn't waste any more time. I pulled the trigger. I had seen heroes shoot villains over the top of their captives' shoulders many times in the movies, but this wasn't make-believe. Instead of taking the villain in the face, my bullet struck our own man in the left shoulder. Fuck. Our man dropped like a stone and the killer reeled back, holding his free hand over his own shoulder. Dumb luck, more than my crappy aim, meant that the bullet had passed through the guard and struck him in the shoulder of his gun arm. It dangled uselessly, and the gun he had stolen a minute before dropped from his numb fingers. He looked at me, fear now swamping any defiance he still had. He wasn't done yet, though. His head began to turn frantically this way and that. I couldn't risk him taking another hostage. I took a deep breath, calming myself as Luke had shown me what seemed like a lifetime before. I whistled, and he looked at me. My second shot took him through the left eye. He fell backwards, the last look on his face, dumb surprise. There was a lot of confusion over the next few minutes. I'm glad Luke and Ben took charge because I think I was in a state of shock. I sat down on the steps and Indigo sat beside me. The gun dangled from my fingers, as heavy as a brick, until Indigo took it away. Her warm hand found mine. You did what you had to do. I could have told her about the fact that I had spotted the prisoner's hands tied in front earlier. That if only I'd made them tie them properly when I spotted it, none of this would have happened. Then again, if Indigo had let me shoot the bastard the day before, he wouldn't have had the chance to kill again. No, it wasn't my fault. I would put this lapse in judgment behind me, just like I had put others behind me since the Chinese had fucked us over. I had to, not only for me, but also for Indigo and little Max. Bo and Jamal put the guard I had accidentally wounded onto a homemade stretcher and took him to the infirmary. Thankfully, he was conscious and didn't appear too distressed. I hoped that was a good sign. Luke had already covered our latest fatality with a sheet. Another dead kid. It was difficult to think of anyone in the valley as anything other than kids. Apart from Jamal, who had a few months on us, Luke and I were the oldest of any of the people in the valley. But no matter what we'd been through or what we were doing, I still felt like a child, albeit one with responsibilities. The dead boy, Ramsey, was just 18. Another marker in our little graveyard. A graveyard which was growing way too quickly. He'd only just been recruited to Luke's security force, and I hadn't even known his name before he was killed. I said as much to Indigo, feeling shittier than ever. You can't know everyone's name, Isaac. There are too many of us now. Come on, let's go see Max. It'll cheer you up. I felt like I should stay and help clean things up, but she was right. I needed to see my boy. He was playing happily with Peace when we went into the house. Has he been a good boy? I asked the little girl. Yep, he sure has, Uncle Isaac. What happened outside? Asked Ava. While Indigo talked quietly to Ava, I picked up Max and gave him a squeeze, smiling at the gurgle he produced. Oh, that's terrible, said Ava. We sat down there for a while before taking Max up for a nap. We lay for a few hours, Indigo and I, in each other's arms while our little man slept. Just before lunch, there was a knock at the door. It was Luke. You okay? He asked. Yeah, what's up? David, the kid who was shot in the arm by the marauders, died a few minutes ago. Oh. He didn't suffer. He was zonked out on morphine. What about the kid I shot? Jamal thinks he'll be okay as long as the wound doesn't get infected. The bullet went through without hitting anything vital. Okay, that's good. Yeah, listen. We have the 3 prisoners at the barn. We've been waiting for you. Not really fair to keep them waiting much longer, you know? Death row and all that. Oh, okay. Shit. Of course. Sorry, I didn't even think of it in all the excitement. I'll come now. 21. The walk to the barn seemed terribly long on that horrible day. So, what is your idea? Gassing them? I should have known Luke would guess my painless and quick execution method. I nodded. Good idea. That's me. I'm a real go-getter when it comes to killing people. Hey, he said, grabbing me on the shoulder. Remember what they did, what they were a part of. You said it yourself. This is the only way. I held his fierce eyes for a moment, then nodded and looked at the ground. I know, man. I'm just a little down on myself for what happened today. I spotted their hands tied in front, but I thought I could wait. I was going to bring it up with you afterwards. Dude, I saw it too. I made a mental note to say something to the boys. That makes me just as guilty as you, right? At least you were able to draw your gun. Mine was stuck in my fucking pants. I chuckled at his pantomime of the effort he made to draw his gun, his hook waving in the air as his good hand tugged at the handle. Lucky you didn't blow your balls off, I said, laughing for the first time in days. Fine. You're just as much to blame as me. Stop waving that hook around. You'll take someone's eye out. Probably mine. I won't describe the execution in detail, but essentially Luke and I banished everyone else from the barn. We took on the responsibility ourselves, unwilling to put anyone else in a position where they had to witness what was to follow. To say I didn't feel sorry for the boys we loaded into the old Chrysler would be a lie. 2 of them broke down when they saw the hose leading from the exhaust to the rear window of the car. It broke my heart. The one who had pleaded his innocence to the murder charge cried and begged for his life as Luke closed the door on him. I saw tears in my friend's eyes, and it hit me how unfair this new world was when kids had no choice but to kill other kids. I think I can speak for Luke when I say it was the most hideous experience of our lives to that point. Taking a life in the heat of battle or in self-defense is one thing, but to have to stand there and watch those boys die behind the windows of that car, no matter how painless, was monstrous. Luke held his breath and switched off the car when we were sure they were dead. I opened the big double doors of the garage, while Luke opened the car doors to let the noxious gas dissipate, and then ran out to join me in the fresh air. A few of Luke's men were waiting for us outside. No one said anything when Luke suddenly darted to the side of the garage and threw up his breakfast. Give it 5 minutes. Then take the bodies to the trees out back and bury them in unmarked graves, I ordered. Do the same with the one I killed. I put my arm around Luke's shoulder and we walked back up to the house in silence, neither of us in the mood for conversation. Late that afternoon, we buried our own dead in the cemetery we had begun in the top paddock of the farm 2 years prior. A boy named Arthur had been our first casualty. He had fallen out of a tree and broken his neck less than 2 weeks after arriving. The second had been a girl, Jasmine, who died from an asthma attack. The third and fourth were the young mother and her baby who had died during childbirth. All of their graves were marked with simple white crosses, their names scratched into them. Senseless deaths in themselves, but somehow less so than the victims of the attack by the marauders. What had been 4 graves now became 12. Altogether too many for such a tiny and young community. We didn't have a funeral as such, but Jamal asked to say a few words for each of the victims. I was glad. While I had said words over bodies before, these deaths hit me especially hard. Not because I was particularly close to any of the deceased, but because the valley was our home, and our home was supposed to be a haven. Safety was something I and the others had promised each of the newcomers, and I couldn't help but feel somehow we had failed them. Jamal's words were well-spoken and poignant, and I reflected upon what a valuable part of our community he had become. It was no wonder he had been elected to the triumvirate with Luke and me. Now that justice had been served and we had buried our dead, we had a hard decision to make. We had put off any decisions until the burials were done, and now that they were, we set a meeting for that night, a meeting where we would have to decide the fate of our whole community. In the meantime, we had doubled the watch on the wall and armed all of the guards with firearms. After the executions and burials, Luke had gone to the top of Boot Hill with his sniper rifle and had stayed there for hours before finally handing it over to Brock. He had told Brooke he wanted to give us early warning and an early advantage should the marauders come back, and that might have been a part of why he had gone up there. But I think he also needed a little solitude after the traumatic events of the day. "22. Indigo and I were in our room an hour before the meeting. Little Max was asleep as we talked in hushed tones about the future of our home. Luke wants to stay. It goes against his code of honor to even think of evacuating, I said. I know it does, but we have to think of our people, Isaac. If these marauders come back with a bigger force, they could slaughter us all. You've heard the reports. There could be more than 1,000 of them, and all killers. I know. I've thought about every option. If we stayed and fought, we would probably take out a few of them, but eventually they would overrun us. We can't let that happen, Isaac. I think we have to do something none of us want to do. We have to leave the valley. We both looked to the cot Ben had built for Max. I knew she was right, but I suspected we would have a hard time convincing the rest of the group. An hour later, we convened in the old kitchen. Indigo and I came in and sat down at the big table. Luke was already there. We were soon joined by Ben, Paul, Jamal, Brooke, Brock, Bo, Danny, and Allie. Indigo chaired the meeting and jumped right in. We can't allow what happened 2 days ago to ever happen again. This special meeting has been called to discuss measures to keep our community safe. I, for one, can't see how we can stay in the valley. Her words were met with some gasps of surprise, and Luke looked at her pointedly. To his credit, he refrained from interjecting and let her finish. We are outnumbered by the marauders, outgunned, and they would show no mercy when they attack again. There are more of them, and they will overrun us. We need to evacuate and find somewhere more defensible and as far away from Ashland as possible. Everyone started to speak over one another, only hushing when Luke rapped his hook on the tabletop. I can see why you feel this way, Indigo, but I say we fight for what's ours. Don't forget, they have a hostage, too. You're right. They would overrun us if we wait for them to come to us. That's why I propose we go to them before they get a chance. We attack them first, and with the element of surprise on our side, we could take them down before they knew what was happening. Yeah, let's do it for Benjamin. It was Brock enthusiastically supporting Luke. Allie disagreed with them loudly, while the others were now more guarded and remained silent. Brooke particularly. She sat quietly, her hand resting on her belly. Luke appeared ready to go on when Indigo spoke over everyone. What about Brooke and the baby, Luke? She said it quietly enough, but her words were just as powerful as if she'd screamed at the top of her lungs. It was one of the few times I had seen Luke without a ready comeback. Brooke's hand grasped his. He looked at her, and she nodded. I spoke in the awkward silence. Indigo's right, Luke. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this ever since the breach. You make good points, but the fact is, even with the element of surprise on our side, the Marauders are better armed and might outnumber us as much as 2-1. Surprise won't help. I looked around at them. I don't like the idea of leaving the valley any more than anyone else. But I also think we can find somewhere not too far away that will be easier to defend and perhaps give us the space we need to keep growing. Who we are is more important than where we are. I gestured to Luke and Jamal. In our leadership group, we've been talking about the future, even before the attack. And all of us agreed that even though we've stopped taking in new people, we still have to move eventually. The time frame we discussed was 2 years, right? Jamal nodded. Yeah, Luke said, looking at Brooke again before addressing all of us. Sorry. You're right. I just want to punish those fuckers so bad for what they did. But if it leaves the people we love dead, it's not worth it. We all want to punish them, Luke, said Allie. But Indigo and Isaac are right. It would be a suicide mission. For all we know, they already killed Benjamin, Paul said, saying what everyone else feared was true. Brock looked up sharply, but didn't say anything. Ben spoke then, before things got awkward. Plus, only about 500 of our population are able to fight. And even then, we would only be able to arm about half of them. The Marauders have at least 1,000, maybe more, and they all fight. Luke nodded. All right. I'm convinced. What's the plan? We don't have a plan, yet, I said. We're going to need to find a location that will house and feed us all, as well as be defensible. A town, maybe? Suggested Ben. Maybe, I said. Or a city. If there's nothing suitable in New Hampshire, we might have to cross the old border into Massachusetts. What about back in the mountains? Maybe Lincoln? Suggested Allie. Silence greeted her suggestion. Perhaps it felt a little too much like going backwards for us, or maybe it just brought back memories we wanted to stay buried. No, Luke said. I don't want to be chipping icicles off my hook every hour. I think further south would be better. Allie smiled and shrugged. Manchester, suggested Paul. Manchester's pretty big. Wouldn't it be too big? Asked Beau. Well, it was the biggest city in New Hampshire, but it's not that big. I think its population was about 110,000 people before the attack, so I'm pretty sure we could grow for 100 years and not fill it up. We could start off populating one part of it and expand as we get bigger. Let's look at the map, Indigo suggested. We went into the living area of the old farmhouse. We had pinned the map of New Hampshire to the longest wall in that room not long after our arrival, and had used it to plan forays and scouting missions ever since. In and around Moultonborough and around Plymouth, it was covered in red lines and X's. Paul traced his finger down the map until it hovered over Manchester. Look, said Luke, a tinge of excitement in his voice. That river, Merrimack, runs through it, but most of the city is on the eastern side. If we could block or blow up the bridge crossing the river there and blockade the other smaller bridges from the western side, we'd only have to worry about one main road in from the south, the 3. Of course, the eastern side would be pretty unprotected, but the only threat we know of for the moment is from the Marauders. Yeah, Paul chimed in. And we could even block the 3 back there where it crosses that smaller river. We discussed the move well into the night, and the more we talked, the more achievable the goal of moving our settlement to Manchester seemed to be. In the end, we didn't even have to vote. It simply became a fait accompli. Of course, that was our core group. We all knew we may have some problems when our decision was relayed to the rest of the valley's population. "We should give them the option of staying," said Brooke. "Yes, Brooke is right," said Ben. "We can't force anyone to come with us. We can only tell them the dangers of staying and hope they make the right decision." "Agreed," said Luke. Indigo and Brooke went to bed, content to let us work out the logistics of moving such a big group of people with our limited resources. "How are we going to do this?" I asked, the enormity of the task suddenly hitting me. "Easy," said Luke. "We go in a convoy. Our armored Hummer at the head, the 3 buses and the 2 SUVs following, then the strongest on foot protected by the other 2 Hummers bringing up the rear." "Do we have enough fuel?" asked Jamal. "Not for all the vehicles, but we'll have to ration it out to make sure the buses have the most and probably the armored Hummer. We should be able to put a good distance between us and the Marauders before any of the others run empty, though. I'm thinking it might even be worth taking a longer route and avoiding the 93 to keep as much distance between us and them as possible." He pointed out a route which would take us east around Lake Winnipesaukee, through Wolfboro, and back southwest to Manchester. "We will use more fuel, and it will take longer. But in the end, it may even be easier to pass. There shouldn't be as many abandoned cars as on the freeways." We agreed with his suggestion and assigned people to look after the logistics. Luke, Ben, and Brock would be in charge of the armory and weapons and deciding who would be armed with the precious few guns we had. Jamal would take care of fueling the vehicles. Paul would be in charge of supplies, while Indigo, Brooke, and Allie would be supervising the younger of the children. I would oversee the whole operation with the help of Bo. The rest of us went to bed at 2 a.m. after deciding we would leave at dawn the following day. That would give us around 30 hours to prepare. As I lay in bed, unable to sleep, a new sense of purpose replaced the last vestiges of anger and sadness at the recent attack and the deaths earlier that day. We just had to hope the Marauders didn't attack before we left. Even if they did, we had our early warning team on motorcycles in place, and in a pinch, we could evacuate in a short time. It would just be much better to leave on our own terms. 23. It's hard to say how I was feeling when we woke up a few hours later. While I was glad to put the last day behind me, beginning what would be our final day in our home had its own kind of melancholy, even if it was tempered somewhat by the anticipation of adventure. As I ate breakfast with my friends and family, I became more and more enthused by their excitement and optimism. Not only were they excited at the prospect of finding somewhere bigger and more permanent for all of us to live, I think they were almost as enthusiastic about simply doing something different, about having an adventure. "We should make the announcement," said Luke, as we helped clear away the dishes. Yep. That part I wasn't looking forward to. We bit the bullet a few minutes later. Luke, Jamal, and I went to the veranda. Luke made his call on the bullhorn. The crowd gathered a little quicker than usual, perhaps in anticipation of something dramatic like the trial the day before. I waited until the flow of people into the square had slowed to a trickle before I began. "Welcome, everybody." There were a few claps and whistles, but the overwhelming impression I got was that the audience was still a little shell-shocked from the events of the last few days, and were wondering what was coming now. I want to start by saying how proud I and the rest of the council are of the way everyone pulled together after the attack and yesterday's trouble. These have been the hardest few days we've had since we settled into the valley, and everybody played their part in fighting off the invaders. I guess that brings me to why we called this special meeting. The attack, as bad as it was, really only served as a warning, a warning that things could get much worse. The small force that attacked us belongs to a larger group which calls itself the Marauders. We are of the opinion, the Council and I, that they will attack us again and it could happen at any time. I left that thought with them for a few seconds before I went on. The next time, we may not be able to stop them. And so we have made the decision to evacuate the valley tomorrow at dawn. There was a shocked silence for a few moments, and then came the uproar I had expected. No! We can fight them. We can't let them chase us out of our home. Please, I began. We're not leaving. No way. Even with the bullhorn, my voice was drowned out. The calls got louder, led by one or two in the crowd who were whipping the rest up, even as others tried to calm things down. Everybody, please, I would like to explain. It was no use. They weren't listening, and I felt things rapidly spiraling out of control. I took a deep breath to yell again. Boom! I flinched. The gunshot from my right took me by surprise. I wasn't the only one. The people at the front of the crowd took a step back, stunned into silence. With the smell of cordite in my nostrils, I turned. Luke was still pointing his pistol at the sky, a tendril of smoke curling into the clear morning air. "You hear that?" he yelled. "If we stay, get ready to hear a lot more of that. Get ready to see your best friend, your girlfriend, or your kid get a bullet through the face. If they're lucky, they'll die in the attack. It will be worse for the ones dragged off by those marauder assholes, while you—" He jabbed his hook at one of the ringleaders, a heavy-set teen who suddenly didn't have a lot to say, "lie bleeding in the dirt." He tucked his gun into the waistband of his jeans and stepped up beside me. I could see he wasn't finished, and I was happy for him to take over. He certainly had their attention. "Now, you all know me. You know I don't run from a fight. At first, I wanted to fight too. But we have to think of the future now." He glanced at the heavily pregnant Brooke. "Truth be told, we are running out of space in the valley, and more than likely would have had to leave within a year or two anyway. We have to go now, a little earlier than expected, that's all. We can't fight the marauders. There are just too many of them, and they are too well armed. We have to move on and make a new home. Now please, let Isaac finish." Luke's intervention did the trick. In his role as head of security, he had become well respected. He was tough but fair, and had the added benefit of being big and kind of scary. He was very different to the tall, gangly nerd I remembered from school. There were no more interruptions as I laid out the plan we had come up with the night before. I was careful not to disclose our destination, just in case there were any who decided to stay. In the worst-case scenario, we thought it best to keep that secret until we were on the road. No amount of torture could reveal a secret no one knew. Now, we realize this is a shock for all of you, and I know you're not all happy about it. I want you to know if you choose to, you are free to stay. We will leave enough supplies for a few weeks and also some weapons for anyone who decides they don't wish to leave the valley. But please, I want you to think carefully before you make that decision, especially given what happened a few days ago. Does anyone have any questions? "So, we leave at dawn?" asked the heavy-set boy Luke had put in his place earlier. I didn't take him to task for his earlier dissension. Yes, we'll head out at dawn. Anyone who decides to stay needs to let Luke and his team know by sunset. The rest of the day was frenetic. Mid-morning, we had a brief visit from Brad, one of Joe's motorcycle team. He informed us there had been no sign of the marauders and grabbed more supplies and refueled before heading back. I told him they were to head back at dawn unless something happened earlier. It wasn't easy to prepare over 800 people for a sudden evacuation, and we were forced to concentrate on big-ticket items like transport, food, and weapons. We had to trust individuals would be able to select the few belongings they would be able to carry carefully. Not that anyone had a lot anyway. Compared to the before days, nearly all of us lived in poverty. That's if you were talking in materialistic terms. Personally, I thought we were better off than a lot of people before the invasion. As the sun began to set that evening, everything was in place. Man, I didn't think we'd get there, but I think we're actually good to go, said Luke as we stood on the veranda drinking a blackberry tea Brooke had brewed for us. It was bitter but palatable. Yeah, everyone pulled together really well. I think we should double the guard on the wall tonight, just in case. Agreed. By the way, I had a couple of people working on something. I didn't run it by you because I thought you'd be okay with it. What is it? I asked. I booby-trapped the old bus we blocked the breach with. Booby-trapped how, Luke? Well, I kind of made it into a bomb. What? Is it safe? We have to go through that gate tomorrow. Yes, it's safe, he laughed. I haven't armed it. I won't do that until everyone else is through the gate. It will be on a hair trigger, though. A nice surprise for those assholes when they come back. What the hell did you make a bomb out of? Lots of stuff, he shrugged. Stuff we won't be taking anyway. Fertilizer, chlorine, spare car batteries, that kind of stuff. How did you... Wait, do I want to know? Ingenuity, dude, and a good memory for stuff I looked up as a bored kid. Damn, I miss Google. You looked up bomb making on Google? You're lucky Homeland Security didn't tap your ass. He shrugged. Maybe they did. You didn't build one, did you? Are you asking if I was planning a terrorist attack or something? He smiled. No, of course not, I said, raising my eyebrows. I was just curious and into science, dude. It's pretty basic stuff, though. Lucky most suicide bombers weren't exactly geniuses. Suicide bombers? Asked Brooke as she came outside to tell us dinner was ready. What are you two talking about? Nothing, my sexy British babe, said Luke, turning Brooke around and encircling her and her belly with his long arms. Better be nothing dangerous, she said, turning her head and pecking him on the cheek. I want this baby to have a daddy, no matter how silly he is. He winked at me as we started into the house, still hugging. Brookster, when have you ever known me to do anything dangerous? Don't worry, I said. I'll keep an eye on him for you. Luke released Brooke just before they went through the door. Oh, wait, I had something else to show you, Isaac. Babe, we'll just be a few seconds. Fine. Hurry up, though, it'll get cold. Cool, he said, and put his arm over my shoulders, directing me back down the stairs. I've had some of the kids working on something. He led me down the stairs and around the side of the house to a stack of something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light until we were closer. They were cutouts, life-size cutouts in the shape of crouching and standing forms. They were even painted so it looked like they were clothed. What do you think? We had to scrape and scrounge for materials, but we got 8 finished. What are they for? Decoys. Before we head out, we'll position them so they are within sight of the road. They might not be ultra-convincing in full daylight, but hopefully they will make them think we're still here. If they come in the dark, there is a good chance it will fool them. I want them coming through that gate with all guns blazing. I shook my head in wonder. Where the hell do you get these ideas from? "Oh, this idea? It's nothing," he said. "I got it from the Ghost Army." I waited, but of course he was in wise one mode and expected me to ask first. "Okay, I give up. What is the Ghost Army?" "Dude, I thought you'd never ask," he laughed. "It was a tactical deception unit the U.S. Army had during World War II. They would do things to trick the enemy, like use inflatable tanks and planes to fool the Germans into believing there was a large force in a particular area, when it was really just a few guys with air compressors and dummies." I looked at him and nodded, a small smile on my face. "What?" he asked. "You know how I've been writing the story of how all this has happened to us? Well, I think you should start writing a history book of all the weird shit you remember that wasn't even in the history books." He laughed. "Dude, it was in the history books. You just weren't reading the right ones. What do you think, though?" he asked, gesturing at the cutouts. "I think it's an awesome idea. Come on, let's go eat. We need to feed that big brain of yours." We ate a light meal that night as the bulk of the food had been packed into the vehicles. There was quiet talk, but the mood was mostly subdued given that it was our final night in the home we had made for ourselves 5 years before. We had finished eating and seemed to all be waiting for someone to make the first move to retire for the evening when Ben jumped from the table and told us all to wait right there. He returned carrying a cardboard box and wearing a big smile. We all craned our necks to see what was inside. "Nuh-uh, no peeking," he said, putting his arm over the top protectively. He looked at Brooke and smiled. "Now, I was saving this for the birth of my nephew or niece, but I figure because this is our last supper in the valley, we ought to celebrate." He produced a dusty bottle and with a flourish showed us the label. I knew the name. Dom Perignon. I knew it was a fancy champagne, but most of the others just looked blankly at him. I guess they knew it was alcohol of some kind, but perhaps not its significance in the before days. We had an unwritten rule that alcohol wasn't allowed anywhere in the valley. Less than 6 months before, we had banished a boy for fighting after he had gotten drunk on a 6-pack of beer he had brought back from a scouting mission. "It's champagne, people." Allie and Ava both wore scandalized looks when they realized it was alcohol. "You're supposed to look happy, not worried. Don't panic. You won't get more than a mouthful each anyway." Despite his reassurance, both girls looked to Indigo, who nodded. "It's okay." Ben proceeded to pull out a variety of mugs and cups of all shapes and sizes and poured us all a small portion each. "Sorry, sis, in your condition, you can't have any. I'll have your share." Allie raised a chipped coffee cup to her lips. "Don't drink it yet," he yelled. Allie jumped, almost spilling the precious liquid. Brooke rolled her eyes at her brother as the chastened girl lowered the mug. "Don't be so bossy, Ben." "Sorry, Allie. Anyway, charge your glasses," he said, raising his tumbler. I watched Brooke raise her glass of water, and we all followed suit. "Here's to our 5 glorious years in the valley. May our next home be as wonderful to us. Cheers!" "Cheers," we all replied. "Yuck," said Ava, making a face after a tentative sip. "I agree," said Allie, laughing after spitting her mouthful back into the cup. "Savages," Ben mocked. We all laughed. I didn't mind the taste. It was kind of bitter, but it had been a long time since I drank something with bubbles in it. The mood got a little more upbeat after that. Allie and Ava both finished their cups after some encouragement and seemed to get tipsy on the tiny nip they were given. For that matter, so did Luke. He ended up having Brooke's portion and also Danny's. The smaller boy couldn't be swayed to drink after his first face-crumpling sip. "My turn to unveil a surprise," said Luke, disappearing upstairs before anyone could ask. When he came back down, he almost tripped on the last step, and both Allie and Ava fell into hysterics as he caught himself. "What have you got there?" asked Brooke, smiling. "You'll see," he said mysteriously. I could see it was a red plastic box about the size of a briefcase. He went to the small coffee table in the corner and sat it down, opening the lid. It was an old portable turntable, a record player. "What is it?" asked Ava, walking over to him. "This is what they used to play music on. Think of it as an old-fashioned iPod." "Really?" "No," he laughed. "It's better than any iPod ever invented." He flicked a switch on the side. I heard the built-in speakers crackle to life as he lifted the arm and moved the needle over and onto the black disc, spitting on the platen. There were a few crackles and pops, and then a repetitive electronic beat began pumping through the tinny-sounding speakers. Luke stepped backwards in time with the music, nodding his head in small, jerky movements as the beat grew louder. Ava squealed, laughing when he grabbed her by the hand and swung her to face him, and then he was off, dancing in a hilarious dad fashion as a voice began to sing, "She was born to be alive, she was born to be alive." We laughed at Luke and screamed encouragement to Ava as she began to try and emulate his moves. "Come on!" Luke called to us over the music, and suddenly Indigo was dragging me into the center of the room, holding little Maxie in the crook of her arm. Pretty soon we were all up there, the very pregnant Brooke included, laughing, screaming, and dancing by candlelight to that dorky but infectious disco beat, forgetting for a time where we were and where we were heading. Luke must have played that damn song 5 times in a row. It was the only record he had managed to find. Before, thankfully, the batteries began to die, and the artist's voice slowed to an unbearable horror movie-like drawl. After the old record player died, we sat around and reminisced for about an hour. We recalled the happy moments rather than the more recent problems, and when Indigo and I went back to our bedroom with Max, I was feeling excited and optimistic about our immediate future. There was also worry, of course, but it had been pushed into the background by the fun that evening. Indigo had already packed, so after she put Max to bed, there was little to do except go to sleep. "Good night. I love you, Isaac Race," Indigo whispered, kissing me good night. "I love you too," I said. We held each other as we went to sleep. It was our last night in the farmhouse. Who knew when we would next sleep in a bed? 24. I woke to the insistent honking of a horn. I sat up, my head sleep-addled. It was coming from the direction of the gate. An engine was approaching the house at speed, and I jumped out of bed, snatching my pistol from the bedside table and running out of the room and down the stairs 2 at a time, barefoot and in my shorts and t-shirt. "What's going on?" Luke yelled, thundering down the stairs behind me. "I don't know," I said over my shoulder as headlights lit up the front windows. With my heart beating furiously, I pulled the door open and ran down the steps as the Jeep from the gate pulled to a stop in a spray of gravel. An excited Brock jumped out and ran over to me. "We got trouble. Headlights coming from the direction of Plymouth. 3 of them. I think it's Joe and the others. But you know what that means." He didn't need to spell it out. If they were returning at this early hour, the marauders were on the move. Luke arrived at my side. He was naked from the waist up, the harness and his hook missing for his night's sleep. "Fuck," he said under his breath. "We only needed a few more hours." "We might still have time, but we need to move now. Brock, drive that Jeep around the valley and make as much noise as you can. I want everyone up and in the staging area, ready to leave within 20 minutes. "Yes, sir." He ran back to the Jeep and took off, planting his hand on the horn as soon as it was in motion. A sleep-tousled Paul and Ben arrived as we turned to head back inside. "Change of plans," I said before they could ask. "We have to leave now. The marauders are on the way. I need both of you dressed and out there rounding everyone up. We're leaving in half an hour." They didn't linger. They knew the gravity of the situation. "Come on. We need to get the girls and everyone else ready to go. Can you send Bo to bring one of the buses down here?" "Yep. Let's roll." Joe and the patrol arrived about 5 minutes after the alarm was raised by Brock. From their vantage near Ashland, Joe, who had been taking the night watch, had seen unusual movement in the Marauders' camp just past midnight. I mean, we watched for a while, but it was pretty clear they were gearing up to move, and it was pretty obvious it was for an attack of some sort. How many? I asked. To be honest, I didn't stay to find out, but to me it looked like the whole camp was being mobilized. I should have stayed. No, you did the right thing. We need time more than intel. I patted him on the back and sent him to help load the buses down by the barn. 10 minutes later, we were loading mothers and younger children onto a bus in front of the farmhouse. That included Indigo, Max, Ava, and Peace. Brooke, in her condition, would also ride with them, with Jamal driving. Both Indigo and Brooke were armed with Chinese pistols. Allie was on the bus, too. She would ride up front with Jamal and was also armed. Take care of my boy, I said, as I hugged Indigo. Of course. You take care of you. I kissed Max on the top of the head and ushered them onto the bus with a lump in my throat. I waited for Luke as he embraced Brooke in a ridiculously long hug. He finally let her go and patted her on the butt with his hook as she walked carefully up the steps. She turned, one hand on her belly, and wagged her finger at him. Keep your hook to yourself. She blew him a kiss before turning and heading into the bus. We both stood there a moment as the bus engine rumbled to life and headed up to the clearing we had designated as the staging area. The whole valley was a hive of activity, roughly illuminated by the occasional torch and the lights of our vehicles. The 2 buses by the barn were filling rapidly, and up in the staging area, I could see the contingent that would be on foot, milling about and ready to move out. For just a second, I nearly freaked out. There were just over 700 that would be walking. It didn't take a genius to figure out that if we did strike trouble, we would lose a lot of them. Come on, I said to Luke, gathering myself. I want to get moving now. We walked up the hill and Luke took the bullhorn from Allie. Open the gates, he called ahead. One of the guards on the hill jumped in the old school bus and the others went to the front and slowly pushed it backwards, unblocking the opening. The last 2 buses rumbled up the hill and Ben and Bo marshaled the pedestrians to allow room for the other buses to join the ones carrying the girls. Line up 5 across, called Ben, as he and Bo walked the line ushering the pedestrians into a marching formation. When they were done, the line curled back down the hill about 150 feet. The rear guard of 2 Hummers pulled in behind them. We had decided to drain the SUVs for fuel and leave them behind. Okay, only one thing left to do, said Luke, and he walked to the lead Hummer and came back holding a rocket launcher. Do you want to do the honors? He asked. I shook my head. We had only decided to destroy the house a few minutes before, and I didn't think I could pull the trigger. Okay. Luke walked 20 feet or so back towards the farmhouse and checked there was plenty of clear space behind him before putting it to his shoulder. The buzzing of the crowd fell silent until all I could hear was the slight breeze rustling the leaves on the trees to our left. Whoomp! The grenade smashed through the front window and exploded, blowing the rest of the windows out in a bright flash. We all watched as our home began to burn. The kerosene Luke had poured throughout the ground floor, doing its job as an accelerant efficiently. Luke tossed the rocket launcher to the ground and turned around after making sure the flames had taken hold. I nodded and took the bullhorn from Ben as we reached the lead Hummer. Ben climbed into the driver's seat as Luke went to the rear of the old bus we had used to block the gate. Together with the guards, he would push it back into place and then arm the bomb before they all climbed the walls and we moved out. I put the bullhorn to my mouth. Attention, everyone. We're heading out. If anyone wants to stay behind, now is the time to say so. I paused a few seconds. No one came forward. Good luck and a safe journey to us all. There was some whistling and clapping as the engines of the Hummers roared to life. I climbed into the lead one and Ben tapped the accelerator as I pulled the door closed. I couldn't resist one last look back over my shoulder at the burning farmhouse as we drove through the gate. We turned left and slowly drove up the hill. We pulled up after about a third of a mile and got out to watch the progress of our convoy. As the last Hummer was coming through the gates, I saw the yellow roof of the old bus as it was slowly pushed back into place. A few minutes later, our entire convoy was ready to move. The guards from the gate joined the pedestrian contingent. Luke was picked up by Brock on one of the bikes, which would serve as outriders, and it raced him up the hill towards us. He waved to the front bus on his way past. I had to admit, from the head of the column, our convoy, or road train, or whatever you wanted to call it, looked pretty impressive. Only a really big force like the Marauders would give us any trouble. Luke arrived and hopped off the bike, giving Brock a pat on the back as he swung the bike around and headed back down the hill. Luke's cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Brock will be hanging back and waiting at the top of the hill when they arrive. We need to know whether the booby trap works and also how many of them there are." "Good call. Hopefully they're still an hour or two away. What time is it?" Luke pulled out the wind-up watch Brooke had given him for his 20th birthday. He loved that thing, especially the fact that it had a stopwatch function. He had removed the band and carried it like a pocket watch now. Not a day went by when he didn't pull it out at some point. 3:37 a.m. "Okay, let's head out."